All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here for the fifth episode of my live stream series. So, just again, regarding the audio, if you're alone, it's best to listen with headphones, or if you're in a group with external speakers, the quality will be much improved. So, today I'm going to be discussing and playing two composers. The first is Erik Satie, and the second, Philip Glass. And I found that both of these composers, I've kind of been drawn to both of them during the confinement because they both have a certain hypnotic effect to them, but also because they kind of disorient the traditional musical language in a way. And so in that we were all kind of, and still are, a little bit disoriented in our everyday lives, this music kind of does the same thing in regards to a lot of other Western music. A lot of it is that it's music that doesn't really have a specific goal, in that so much of Western music is about reaching a harmonic goal, a sense of a narrative, and both in the Satie and the Glass, we don't really have that. And it almost reflects like what we've been experiencing, or what a lot of us have experiencing recently, is that a lot of these goals or things that we normally have to do, going from here to there and accomplishing that, and these kind of basic things that we use to structure our lives, no longer are there. And this music kind of reflects that. So, and I'm not alone. I mean, Satie, there was an article in LA Times where they talked about how Satie was kind of a reflection of our times, or the music for the confinement. They were specifically talking about the Vexations, a piece that lasts around 18 hours, but we'll get to that in a second. So yeah, let's start with Satie. So born in 1866, he is the same generation as Debussy. Debussy was 4 years older, but musically, really, they're in the same musical universe. And as I talked about in the episode with Debussy, the big influence of their time was the Franco-Prussian War, so their loss to the Germans. But then, even more importantly, at least for the artist, and connected to that, was the influence of Wagner, and just kind of the overbearing influence of German music and of Wagner's music on all of the arts in France. So what that did is it did several things, but two of those things was the first, that the French were invigorated to start composing some in the style of Wagner, but also using his I don't want to say research, but the kind of novel things that he was doing to apply that to their French culture, like going back to some distant past and bringing, whether it's Gregorian chant or myth, things like that, but with a truly French style. So there were those composers, and then there were others like Debussy and Satie, who really wanted to reinvent French music completely and find something truly, truly different. And Satie arguably could be really the first to do that before Debussy. And Satie famously said, "We need to find our own French music, preferably without sauerkraut." So he was very much, really knew what he was trying to do with his music, pulling away from Wagnerism, which was so dominant. And the way he did that was through fantasy, through humor, through irreverence, really undermining everything that the Austro-German tradition had produced, and even the French tradition as well. So the one thing that Wagner was never really able to do was laugh at himself. So Satie, throughout his entire career, it's just joke after joke. It's never taking himself seriously. You never know whether he's making fun of something, or whether he's being honest, or whatever. It's this kind of absurd fantasy that really comes to influence French art and French music in a tremendous way, and really defines the French style. In a certain sense, more even than Debussy. So Satie he went to the Paris Conservatory, but was a terrible student, was known as the laziest student in composition. He then, I think he was thrown out. Then he went to the army for a bit, got sick, got sent home. He moved to Montmartre, of course, this artistic center of Paris at the time. And he started working in the cabaret, the Le Chat Noir, the famous cabaret. But it wasn't the cabaret as we now know it, with kind of a nightly show or whatever. It was really a group of artists, poets, painters, musicians that would come together, that would try things out, that would discuss, that would have conversations, and they even put out a publication with some of these works. So it's in that context that he was trying out different things. He also became involved with Joséphin Péladan, who had this Rosicrucian society, the Rose and Cross, which was kind of, influenced by Wagner to a certain extent, but going back to kind of medieval occultism, Christian esoteric traditions, and then combining that with artistic ideas. So we have this sense of art, religion as art, performance as religion, kind of that's, very Wagnerian, with the festival, the stage consecration play, that the performance becomes almost like a religious experience, and the performative aspect of religion. And once you've seen that, once you've seen religion and religious acts and rituals as theater, as performance, it's very difficult to go back. So this was very much the time. So he was writing music for this society, and involved in kind of these mystical ideas. But as always, we never know to what extent he was serious about it. It always had this underlying quality of humor, and also that he could abandon it at any moment if he changed his mind. So he did. He eventually created his own church, the Metropolitan Art Church of Jesus the Conductor, and he was the only member. And he would write letters, and everything was very official. But it's something that kind of never really caught on, I guess. So this is around the time where he wrote some of his most famous piano pieces, the Gymnopédie, the Gnossienne, stuff that you'll hear a little bit tonight and that everyone knows very, very well. Very accessible pieces for amateur pianists as well, because they're not incredibly virtuosic. So yeah, it's very much in this sense of the flaneur, the guy who's just kind of idling, who doesn't really want to write, to compose in any traditional genres, who's kind of doing his own thing, and who has no care for proper voice leading in his compositions, who doesn't really follow any of the rules. He's someone that believes that, going to school is about just doing exercises, and it's like gymnastics. It's completely devoid of any artistic or aesthetic idea. And he was only interested in the artistic, in the aesthetic, not at all interested in the compositional process and all of that. That did change in 1905. He decided to sign up for a course at the Scola Cantorum in Paris, the school that Vincent d'Indy founded, in contrast to the Paris Conservatory, which was very, very traditional and conservative. And so d'Indy wanted a school that was going to really to study symphonies, to study German repertoire, but also to study Palestrina, Renaissance, Gregorian chant, counterpoint. So really getting back to these very old and then much more recent German symphonic works. So Satie spent 3 years there studying counterpoint, and he left with a diploma and as a counterpuntist. But no one was ever happy. He wrote in a letter saying, "At first, you criticized me that my pieces were too simple, that they were childlike, too innocent, that there was no structure, there was no content. And now that I've, studied counterpoint, you're telling me that they're too austere, that there's nothing interesting, that why can't you just go back and play those pieces you wrote before that were charming," and saying, you can never really win. In 1911, he had a lot of success thanks to Ravel, who was a huge fan of his and recognized the influence that Satie had on French music. So specifically, he wanted to hold a concert at the Salle Gaveau in 1911 where only Satie's pieces would be played. And it was a huge success, and Ravel framed that in the by following the idea that Satie was the person who influenced this current contemporary musical trend in France, that he was at the source of it and not Debussy, because there was a slight rivalry between Ravel and Debussy. And so Ravel saying, look, it's not Debussy that we need to look towards, it's Satie. He is the one who really pushed us forward. So in any case, they performed the Gymnopédie and the Gnossienne, and that really brought a certain amount of prominence. It's interesting too that, just as an example, so again from that same period around 1890, someone would criticize Satie and say there's no structure to your music, it has no form. And so he writes then morceau en forme de poire, piece in the form of a pear, by saying, yes, it has a form, the form of a pear, so always this kind of absurd quality in response to the traditional demands. Later on in life, he outlived Debussy. Debussy died in 1918, and he outlived Debussy by 7 years, dying in 1925. But he then was very involved with the Dadaist movement, with Cocteau, who was a huge devotee of Satie and really recognized what he had done. And they worked together with Pablo Picasso as well on the work Parade, which was a great success, but also an incredible event in Paris, in that half of the audience was booing, the other half was applauding. It was kind of a riot. And then there was a critic who wrote to Satie, or who wrote an article being very critical. And Satie wrote to him, "Cher monsieur, cher ami, vous êtes un cul, pire un cul sans musique," meaning, dear sir, friend, you are an ass, worse, an ass without music. The critic sued him, and in court, Cocteau was yelling at the critic, saying, "Vous êtes un cul, you're an ass," And Satie got thrown in jail for, he only had to serve 8 days, but that was kind of, he was, the mauvais garçon, I guess, the bad boy. So, all right. And then he died of alcoholism, cirrhosis, in 1925. He lived in Arcueil, so originally in Montmartre, but then he moved to a very working class suburb, and he lived the majority of his life there, walking every day into Paris with a hammer in his coat for protection. After his death, Milhaud, the composer who really adored Satie, and Cocteau went to his house. No one had been there in over 30 years, and it was a complete mess. Letters, unopened letters, manuscripts stuffed in his suit pockets, all over the place. And they found all this music. One of the pieces they found was this famous Vexations, or Vexation, this very short piece that is intended to be repeated 840 times. And so the problem, this was never performed in his lifetime, and there are no other notes, so we don't know, is this a complete joke? Did he really mean it? But people have been doing it. The first performance was actually in the 60s in New York with John Cage, with John Cale, who would become a founding member of the Velvet Underground, a whole group of pianists kind of taking turns. But recently, Igor Levit, the Berlin-based pianist, did a live stream performance of it during this confinement period. So it was about a few weeks ago, and Alex Ross from The New Yorker, the music critic, wrote a lot about it, and it was very interesting. So he sat at the piano, and what he did, actually, he had the page printed 840 times. So he would then, every time that he played it once, then he would take the page down, and then the second, and etc. 840. Took him, I think, about 17 hours, something like that. It's very strange music, not very memorable, but it's this kind of repetition, and people can attach various significance to it, or insignificance, like a lot of Satie's work. All right, so let's hear some music. So I'm going to play 3 different selections. The first is the first Gymnopédie, of course, very famous piece, much loved by many people. And just quickly, the title Gymnopédie is an invented word. It was very much in the trend of the symbolists, to kind of invent words that didn't necessarily have a very clear meaning. Maybe it was just the music, the sound of the word that was interesting to them, or the mystery. So I wouldn't necessarily attach too much importance to that word. It can mean it has something to do with like young boys in Sparta who would dance naked, for some reason. I don't know, but it's that's kind of if we look at the etymology of the words. But it's not really, it doesn't appear that there's any connection with that in the music. It's much more in this kind of symbolist approach. Then after that, the Gnossienne, two of them, the first and the third, also very well known. And again, the same thing with the name. There's Gnostic there, which is kind of these deep, unearthed secrets, ideas, whatever, mythical. So kind of in line with that Rosicrucian thing, but once again, it's somewhat unclear to what extent we should take that. What's important to know about these Gnossiennes is that there are text indications for the pianist in the score. So you have it's basically these repeating harmonies and then these melodies, and then above the melodies Satie writes indications, and they're not typical conventional indications like speed up, slow down, loud, soft, whatever. They're things kind of very mystical, esoteric, things like open your mind right above a melody, or arm yourself with clairvoyance above another one, or step by step, like all of these very very curious little indications. As always, we don't really know what he means by it, but it's a very interesting idea, kind of dealing with giving instructions to the state of mind of the player as they play, rather than them using maybe instinct or whatever. They're thinking about those phrases as they play the melody, and it could, and it does, I think, have an impact. So two of those, and then the final piece is a nocturne. So Satie wrote a total of 5 nocturnes. I'm going to play the first. And this is very, very different. So this is from 1915. This is one of his last works for piano. It's very austere. There's no humor, at least that's evident. And you'll hear the style. I mean, there's some counterpoint. There's more in terms of harmonic progression, but it's very bleak at the same time. It does not have the same charm, but it is incredibly attractive. For whatever reason, I find that I can't really stop playing it. It's something that, I'm not really sure why. It's an interesting piece, very different from the first two. All right, so Satie, Gymnopédie number 1, Gnossienne number 1 and 3, and Nocturne number 1. All right. So you can hear that last piece, the Nocturne, written in 1915, how different it is from the early works. And with Satie, I mean, you can find works that resemble. There are many works that resemble the first, the Gymnopédie, the Gnossienne. But then there are always surprises. He was constantly reinventing himself throughout his entire life, even so that, I mean, at the end, people were very, very, very critical of him, saying, you know, that he completely, it's a sad story of this eccentric man that could never really settle on a style, and that was just kind of constantly searching. All right, moving over to Philip Glass. So through Satie somehow, the reception of Satie was very strong in the United States, particularly because of John Cage. So when I talked about John Cage's piece In a Landscape in the first episode, I mentioned his time at Black Mountain College in 1948. And during his time there, he was, of course, very influenced by Satie. He would perform every night a complete recital of various works of Satie, and they put on some of his productions. And so he was very much part of that. Now, Philip Glass was not necessarily influenced by Cage. I mean, everyone was influenced by Cage, but he wasn't like a follower, let's say. But it did, I think, definitely this idea of repetition, of using harmony in a different way, so that it's not necessarily traditional progressions, but taking maybe 2 or 3 different chords, like you just heard, A minor, F major, G minor, something like that, repeating them, juxtaposing them, but always often in this very different way. So that's something that Glass does. I don't know whether it's directly influenced by Satie, but there's definitely a similarity. So Philip Glass is often considered a minimalist composer, even though he doesn't consider himself one. But that's just another example of this kind of pigeonholing that exists in the arts and in many things, where we always have to say, oh, you're this, you're that. You know, it makes life easier maybe, but even in the case when the composer themselves say, no, I'm not that, then there's still kind of this insistence, or at least it just sticks. I mean, same with Debussy and Impressionism. Good luck trying to change people's idea on that. So, you know, when we talk about the minimalists, it's generally Riley, Steve Reich, Lamont Young, Philip Glass. And then, of course, minimalism influenced many, many, many composers. Including film music. I mean, there's so much film music that's either by Philip Glass or very similar to Philip Glass. So talking about if we talk about minimalism, it's basically it's a few things. So reduced compositional techniques and restricted techniques. So they're working with much less material, but over a much larger span of time, in that there's repetition and slow change throughout the time span. So they're using much less material. This is a clear turn away from serialism, from the complex neoclassical or academic music of, let's say, obviously Boulez, Stockhausen, but Milton Babbitt as well. So there's a clear turning away from that. In this type of repetitive music, but quickly, so for it to be purely minimalist, you have to have that reduced techniques, reduced and restricted techniques. This also omnipresent pulse, this continuing pulse throughout the piece, usually though without harmony and without much in terms of melody, and then also very subtle changes over long periods of time. It's generally doesn't follow a narrative. So similarly, like what I was mentioning in the beginning, it's not teleological. So we're not going towards this goal or anything. It's just kind of music, sound existing and then not existing, rather than in a lot of Western music, Western classical music, before this, we have a feeling of moving towards something, and then a feeling of arrival, and then of departure. Whereas this music of Glass or of Riley or whoever, it really doesn't follow that same trajectory. It's very much, it's static in a sense, and the drama is generally, there isn't much drama, although with glass, that changes. But since he's not a real minimalist, it doesn't matter. So quickly, composers moved away from this. And so we can talk about post-minimalism, but we get to a point where each composer is doing different things, has a very distinct language, but there are things that are similar. So for glass, it's these repetitive structures. That's how he describes it. Repetitive structures over time that are juxtaposed. Another important thing for him is additive rhythmic principles. So, you start with a duple, then a triplet, then a sextuplet, etc. And that you'll hear in the work Madrush, which is what I'm going to be playing. That's definitely a principal thing. And with glass, of course, harmony is very important. He was always interested in harmony, and it's an integral part to his work. So that already kind of disqualifies him as a minimalist, because we do have some harmonic progression. So I'd say glass is using minimalist techniques with repetition over long spans of time, but with some romantic ideas, with some definitely tonal ideas. And minimalism has been criticized a tremendous amount. Boulez, of course, hated it, said it had no content. It's music meant for just sitting. I mean, it's useless. But it's been incredibly successful in the United States and throughout the world. It's music which is rare in the 20th century, music that people actually want to listen to. So that's something that it definitely was a success, I'd say. So Philip Glass was born in 1938. He's still alive, of course, in Baltimore. He went to the pre-college program at Peabody, University of Chicago, Juilliard. A significant event was in 1966 when he received a Fulbright Award to study in Paris with Mademoiselle Nadia Boulanger, so the great pedagogue of the 20th century, who had an influence on American music that was unprecedented, whether it's Copland or Ned Rorem, or many. It was kind of like a pilgrimage, let's say, for many American composers. And what was amazing with Nadia Boulanger is that she taught the basics, Bach and Mozart, and with Philip Glass it was the same. She didn't teach an aesthetic necessarily. She taught compositional technique. She taught fundamentals of analysis and understanding, just to be a complete musician. But she wasn't telling students, the type of music to write necessarily. So her students, there's a huge variety of styles that came out of that. So he was, of course, very influenced by that. He also traveled to India. He was influenced by Ravi Shankar. And during his time in India, he met Tibetan refugees, and he became involved with the Tibetan liberation movement, and in some sense a follower of the Dalai Lama. So back then in New York, in this piece that I'm going to be playing, Madrush, was written in 1979 for the first trip of the 14th Dalai Lama to North America. And I'm forgetting the name of the church in New York, St. John the Divine, I think that's what it is. So he was going to come to St. John the Divine to give a speech in New York, and they asked Philip Glass to compose a piece to be played while people were waiting, because they didn't exactly know what time he would arrive. There was some flexibility. So they asked him to write a piece originally for organ, and it was of indeterminate length, so it was the type of piece that could just continue on endlessly until the Dalai Lama arrived, and then he could just stop. So that was the occasion that it was written for. The original title was not Madrush. That title was added later when the same music was used for a dance work of Lucinda Childs, which had the name Madrush, so that name was then applied to it. So what you'll hear, it's a very consonant work. It's very pleasing. It's very hypnotic. Some people, I think, have trouble with this type of music. Other people find it very, very moving. It really depends. But in any case, the listening experience is drastically different from listening to a Mahler symphony, obviously. There is, again, this kind of passive, maybe, listening in a sense, but the idea is that it's supposed to have kind of a serene effect on the listener. There are events that occur throughout. There are structural moments. So often you've heard me talk about, like in the Schubert Klavierstück, the A section, the B section, the C section, all of that. like a 5-part rondo or something. All of those sections are delineated by harmonic changes by tonal centers. So you'll have the tonic in one section. A section is the tonic, B section dominant, C section relative minor, whatever. They're key centers. That is, throughout all of the history of Western music, that's often how we're defining form, is through tonality, through key center. That is no longer the case here. Now, in a lot of the 20th century music, and in this piece, form is related to texture. So if you have a change in texture, then that becomes kind of like a goalpost, let's say, and then another change in texture, that's another one, and then the sections become defined based on changes in texture rather than changes in key, because there really aren't any. This piece is, it's tonal. It's not traditionally tonal, but it's definitely uses tonal language. And so I think I've talked enough about it, because I'm making it sound complicated. It's not. There's a simplicity to it, and it really does speak for itself. You might recognize it, Philip Glass, as I titled this. What did I say? Have you heard this before? It's like both Satie and Glass. Their music is everywhere, in film, in TV. And as you listen to the Satie, I'm sure you had images in your mind. Those images probably are related to television and TV. It's the same with Glass. And also because there's this repetitive structure in both of them. So not only have you heard it before, maybe on TV, but you've heard it because you just heard it, because it repeats. That's its nature. All right, so Mad Rush, the last thing I'm going to say is that the piece is not of indefinite length, as it was originally intended, but he has a certain number of repeats in sections, and then measures and whatever. But he's not particularly dogmatic about it, so you can do shorter or longer versions. So I've made my version. I'm not doing all of the repeats. Some of them are left out. With all of the repeats, it's about, I think, 19 minutes. But because of the Zoom setting, I think it's better to shorten it a little bit. So, all right, Mad Rush by Philip Glass.